Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. So, we will continue from where we left off yesterday, and we have the last topic of theme number 1, which we are yet to cover, which we will cover now, and then we'll move to theme number 2, which is preamble, territory, and citizenship. So, the last topic of theme number 1 and the climax of the topic, we are going to discuss the 4 golden rules of Indian polity. The 4 golden rules of Indian polity. Now, these 4 golden rules are not mentioned in any of the standard reference textbooks that you will often refer to. On the other hand, these 4 golden rules have been derived from the debates of the Constituent Assembly and therefore are a justification to everything that happens right from the very first article of the Constitution to the very last article of the Constitution. Okay. So these 4 golden rules, as we would know them to be, are these 4 golden rules which explain the why to polity. And if you understand the why to polity, you will have no problems in solving the what to polity. Right? That is something we must understand. The purpose of these 4 golden rules is multifold. First, it will give you immense conceptual clarity right from the very first set of lectures. 2, if you are faced with a prelims question that you have very little idea about, these 4 golden rules will help you arrive at the correct answer. And third, it is these 4 golden rules that will help you cross-check your answer and attain a 100% accuracy to the option that you have marked as the correct one, because you will be able to cross-check the validity of that answer by these 4 golden rules. Okay, they are very similar to the rules of physics, the rules of motion in physics, in the sense that they make polity more scientific and more mathematical in its approach than more social science based, right? There are basically 4 rules. Rule number 1 is called democratic mandate. Rule number 1 is called democratic mandate. Rule number 2 is called the federal balance. Rule number 2 is called the federal balance. Rule number 3 is called separation of powers. Rule number 3 is called separation of powers. And rule number 4 is called checks and balances. Checks and balances. Now, we will study each of these rules one by one, whereas we will study rule number 3 and rule number 4 together because they are related to one another, and both of these rules, separation of powers and checks and balances, both of these rules, separation of powers and checks and balances, are going to have 2 sub rules each. 2 sub rules each. So we'll cover them in the appropriate detail as is necessary. Okay? So let us begin and let us get this part right. First, rule number 1, democratic mandate. Rule number 1, democratic mandate. Okay. Now, Let us understand this rule and let us forget about polity for some time. Let's understand this through some day-to-day life examples around us. Right? Now, the word mandate basically means the authority given to a person to do something. The word mandate means the authority given to a person to do something. Now let's understand this as clearly as we can. You see, for example, when we study the first golden rule, let's forget about the rule for a minute and let's understand this in an unrelated manner. Now, I am your subject teacher for polity and law. What makes me competent enough or reasonably competent enough to teach you the law or to teach you constitution for that matter? The first is that I am trained in the subject. I am professionally, educationally trained in the subject. The second is I have been teaching this subject for almost a decade to several students across different platforms. The third is myself, I've had a limited amount of exposure to the exam. Unsuccessful as it might be, I am still well versed with the exact process and nature of this exam, and therefore I am able to visualize polity as an integral part of this exam. Now, because of these three reasons, it is my humble belief that I am competent enough to teach this subject to the students preparing for the civil services. If I don't have these three reasons, if I wasn't a lawyer, if I wasn't teaching this subject to students for about 10 years, and if I myself would have not had an exposure to the exam in an individual capacity, I may not be able to be equipped enough to teach the subject in the relevant amount of detail to you. So my mandate is that I am a lawyer, I've been teaching this for a while and I have had an exposure to the exam. Therefore, I have the mandate to teach you polity. Right? If I myself don't have this, then I have no business giving you gyan on how to study polity and to teach you polity. Right? In a very simple but a crude manner, दुनिया उखाड़ने से पहले खुद तो उखाड़ के दिखाओ. दुनिया उखाड़ने से पहले खुद तो उखाड़ के दिखाओ, है ना? So let's apply this to democratic mandate. The democratic mandate principle is a very simple one. It means in order to perform any advanced or higher democratic function, one must have some form that could be direct or indirect, some form that could be direct or indirect, some form of a democratic mandate. मतलब आप कोई भी हायर डेमोक्रेटिक फंक्शन करना चाहते हैं इस देश में, आपके खुद के पास वो मैंडेट है कि नहीं वो फंक्शन करने के लिए. Which means the corollary of this rule is also true. That if you don't have the necessary democratic mandate, then you are not competent enough to perform that democratic function. So not only is the rule true, but also the corollary of the rule is also true. So democratic mandate means to perform an advanced democratic function, you would require some form of democratic mandate, and if you don't have the democratic mandate of any form, you cannot perform the democratic function. Now let us look at the application of this rule through a diverse range of examples that you will find in polity, in constitution and the structure of this country. Okay, let's understand this basic democratic mandate rule. First, to be a minister, you need to be an MP if we are talking about the center. Similarly, if you are talking about the states, you have to be to be a minister in the state, you have to be an MLA or an MLC in the state. Same thing. But why do you have to be an MP so that you can become a minister? If you are not an MP at the time of becoming a minister, you are given 6 months to become an MP. It doesn't matter, you can be an elected MP or a nominated MP. You can be an MP of the Lok Sabha or the Rajya Sabha. But the least form of your democratic mandate is that you have to be an MP so that you can be a minister, even if not immediately, but within 6 months. Because as a minister, you are performing an advanced higher function of executing policy in the country, of formulating policy in the country, of making key decisions which are going to affect the lives of millions in this country. The least we expect out of you is that you are representing some form of people in the country. If you are not, then you don't deserve to be the minister. Now it is okay. You can be a Rajya Sabha MP and a minister in the center, because it is the majority in the Lok Sabha who would want you to become a minister even if you're a Rajya Sabha MP. For example, take the case of Arun Jaitley, take the case of Jaishankar. Forget about these two, take the case of our very own Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. Manmohan Singh was the Prime Minister of the country, but he was a Rajya Sabha MP. Not that immediately, but within 6 months, he became the Rajya Sabha MP. And despite being a Rajya Sabha MP, he was the Prime Minister, because the Congress had majority in the Lok Sabha and they authorized and they wanted Manmohan Singh to become the Prime Minister of the country. Right? So that is something we must understand. Your democratic mandate is that you have been chosen from at least one out of the two houses. It's okay. Direct election, indirect election, elected, nominated, Lok Sabha, Rajya Sabha, it is fine. But you have been chosen as a member of parliament, even if not immediately at the time of appointment, but within 6 months of becoming a minister. This is the simplest application of democratic mandate, right? Now let's look at some other examples. For example, we know, and we will do this in detail, don't worry. Rajya Sabha MPs, the ones that who have to be elected, are elected by the respective state legislative assemblies and are elected by the MLAs of the respective state legislative assemblies, but only and only the elected MLAs. Now, of course, we will not have nominated MLAs anymore, but even if we did, nominated MLAs will not participate in the election of a Rajya Sabha candidate by the assembly. Because if you are performing in the advanced function of choosing a Rajya Sabha MP who's going to represent the interest of your states, you yourself should have been elected to represent the state interests. Then only Will you participate in the election of a higher office in that context? So, an application of rule number 1, democratic mandate. Similarly, when we look at the election of the president, right? The president is elected by the Lok Sabha, by the Rajya Sabha, and by the state legislative assemblies. We'll cover this in detail when the time is right. And only by the elected members of these houses, not the nominated members. So the nominated members of the Rajya Sabha also don't participate in the election to the president. If you are participating in the advanced function of choosing the very first citizen of the country, the highest constitutional office in the country, you yourself should have been elected in the first place. If not, then you don't have the right to participate in a presidential election. A simple application of what is called a democratic mandate, rule number 1. And not only this, there are some advanced examples where this democratic mandate principle will apply seamlessly. For example, let us take the case of something called ordinances. Now, we will do this in detail later on. Ordinances powers of the center and the states are exactly similar. 123 for the presidential ordinances and 213 is the article number for governor related ordinances. Let's take the case of the center because it's easier to relate. So how does this work? An ordinance is basically a temporary law which is drafted by the Council of Ministers, directly sent to the President for the assent or for the signature of the President when the Parliament is not available or the Parliament is not in session. Now you would see this is an application of rule number 1, democratic mandate. Why? Why is it a temporary law? It is a temporary law because the only people who have the powers to make a law at a national level are the Parliament. And they are the people, collectively as the Parliament, who can finally decide that this law should be made. That is why it is temporary, and if the Parliament comes back to session and doesn't pass the same ordinance within 6 weeks, the ordinance automatically ceases to exist. The ordinance automatically lapses. Why do the Council of Ministers get to draft an ordinance? It's because in the absence of the Parliament, the next best set of people who have the mandate as a temporary measure will still be the ministers. Why does the President get the powers to directly sign an ordinance and you have bypassed the Parliament? The executive is basically performing the job of the Parliament in the case of an ordinance. It's because the President has the mandate, as the President has been elected by all the 3 uniform legislative houses in the country. So that is how ordinances are also applicable as rules and applications of democratic mandate. Okay. Another simple application of this would be, why do you think that the advice or the suggestions given by any body, any amount of bodies, whether it's a constitutional body or a statutory body, any body, these bodies and the advice given by them are not binding? Whether it is a CAG, whether it is NHRC, they're not binding. They are not binding because the bodies are appointed authorities. They are not elected. They don't have the mandate to compulsorily tell the elected people that this is what you have to do under all circumstances. Even within the parliament, the recommendations given by the parliamentary committees are not binding. And I understand parliamentary committees will comprise of MPs. But if you compare parliamentary committees to the parliament, the final mandate to make a law will still lie with the parliament. So anything that the parliamentary committee says cannot be made binding because it will violate the final democratic mandate of the parliament. So this one rule that we saw was applicable in 1, in 2, in 3, in 4, in 5, in 6 places. And this is just at the top of my head. I can give you 20 examples of this rule. These are the first 6 examples that came to my head. Understood this? Are we clear with rule number 1? Do we understand rule number 1? Yes or no? Are we clear with rule number 1? Yes? Are we clear with rule number 1? Yes or no? Alright. Now, we move to rule number 2. Federal balance. We now move to rule number 2, which is federal balance. Okay? So let's understand this as clearly as we can, as accurately as we can. Okay? Now, as you would know, federal balance means this is going to be about center and states. Okay? So, let's look at it. This is the second rule. Let us forget about federalism in polity for some time, and let us spend some time on on a simple family dynamic. What I am going to say next is going to offend you if you are a younger sibling. It is going to please you if you are an elder sibling. And I am also an elder sibling, so I am biased towards all my fellow elder siblings, and it is a fault and I am guilty of it. So, in the Indian family scenario, elder siblings have a fundamental right to bully, to harass, and to beat the younger siblings to pulp, black and white, to bruise them. And I'm saying this irrespective of gender. We as elder siblings have a fundamental right to harass our younger siblings, right? And whenever we harass our younger siblings, whenever we harass the younger ones, how does that dynamic work? They will usually make a face. They will usually, threaten us that they are going to go to the parents and complain. And what do? We superficially please them. We tell them that you are not adopted. Your parents love you equally. They don't, but they love you equally. and we give them a toffee or a candy to make them feel good. And the younger siblings believe that we as elder siblings genuinely care for them, which is not the case. So when they open the wrapper of the toffee, they find a stone inside. But by that time, enough time has passed and they can't complain to the parents. Right? So this is exactly what is rule number 2, federal balance. Rule number 2, federal balance, is going to have 3 steps. Where the elder sibling is the center and the younger sibling are the states. So in step number 1, the center will do something to overpower the states. The center will do something to overpower the states. Alright, this is the first step. The second step is going to be to compensate for that, to please the state. The center is going to give a candy to the states. Okay? We'll try to please the states. We'll try to provide for some kind of compensation. We'll try to compensate the states. There will be a candy. And the third step that we are talking about, the final step, is when the states open the candy, they will find that it is a hollow candy. So it's going to be a hollow candy once we understand the meaning of the candy, right? A hollow candy. And therefore, it is nothing but hollow appeasement. Okay? This is your rule number 2. First, identify how the center is stronger than the states. Then figure out what is the candy that is being given by the center to the states. And then finally, figure out how the candy is a hollow candy. Figure out how the candy is an empty candy. And if you're able to do all the 3 things, you know your federal balance rule is intact. Ladies and gentlemen, this is basically what your rule number 2 is. And there are a plethora of examples, in an unending list of examples for rule number 2. So let us look at the examples that we can use as far as rule number 2 is concerned. Okay, so let's start with something very basic. Let us see how we can use it in the simplest form. Right, in the simplest form. So we will do this in detail in the second theme itself. For example, in the case of territory, okay, all territorial changes are executed by the parliament by a law. The states have absolutely no formal role. The states have absolutely no formal role whatsoever. Okay, no formal role as far as territory is concerned. For example, if I want to bifurcate Uttar Pradesh into Uttarakhand, Andhra Pradesh into Telangana, or Jharkhand for that matter, or Chhattisgarh for that matter, the decision on that will be taken by the parliament, not the states. So, step number 1, center stronger than the states. That all territorial changes happen by the center. Now this of course violates the integrity of the states. It violates the autonomy of the states. So we have to give them a candy. The candy is, if it is an internal reorganization, if you are reorganizing the states internally, you are redrawing a state boundary, dividing a state into 2, merging 2 states into 1, converting a state into a union territory, a union territory into a state, either of the things, right? before the law reaches the parliament, the president refers the law to the concerned state legislature for their opinion. For their opinion. States are very happy that my opinion is being asked, my view counts, they're very happy with the candy, but then they start opening the candy. When they start opening the candy, they realize step 3 has happened to them. That when the president asks for the opinion of state legislatures, that opinion of the state legislatures is not binding at all to anybody. For example, in the case of bifurcation of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, the president in 2014 would have called up the Andhra Pradesh legislature and said, what is your view on bifurcating Andhra Pradesh into Telangana? And then they would have, Andhra Pradesh would have said, thank you for calling, sir. My views on this are, and president would have said, okay, bye, and cut the phone down. Just cut the phone down. It is required for you to ask for their opinion, but it is not compulsory for you to listen to their opinion. So this is rule number 2, where in a territorial manner, we have, hit the states where it hurts the most. A simple application of rule number 2. Okay, I'll give you several examples. Similarly, let us take the case of state legislative councils. Now, there are 8 states in the country which have legislative councils. The last state to have a legislative council is Andhra Pradesh and Telangana after the bifurcation, and those are the only states that have a legislative council. Now, the legislative councils are actually authorized by the parliament. The parliament makes or authorizes the creation of a legislative council in the state. Okay, which means center is stronger than the states. What business does the parliament have in telling a UP whether you can have a council or not? It is UP's problem, it is UP's democracy, it is UP's legislature. But no, UP can only have a legislative council if the Parliament of India says that yes, you can have a legislative council. Okay, fair enough. Now, step number 2. This is obviously perverse to the idea of state interest. Now, step number 2. The Parliament can only create a legislative council if the state legislatures have requested for the same. You would remember this from Special Majority 1 that we had discussed yesterday when we were discussing majorities. The Parliament can only create a council in a state if the legislature of the state wants a council. So the request must come from the Parliament. States are happy, their chests are beaming with pride that until we don't ask for a council, the Parliament cannot give us a council. Until we don't ask for a council, the Parliament cannot give us a council. And they are feeling like they are the Avengers. Wait until step number 3 is going to hit the states. Wait until step number 3 is going to hit the states. And it is going to hit the states so badly that you and I can't even fathom, can't even imagine how badly is it going to hit the states. Unquestionably. Because step number 3 is, just because the states have requested does not mean that the Parliament necessarily has to give them a council. Sikkim has been requesting for the last 20 years. Parliament has not given them a council. Very recently, after the West Bengal election, and where the Chief Minister of West Bengal had lost in her MLA constituency, the West Bengal government thought, let us have a council so that it will be a safe passage for our key functionaries. The West Bengal Assembly passed a resolution, said we want a council. Parliament has not created a council yet, has not authorized it, which is also why a question on legislative councils was asked in the mains exam this year. A question that I had specifically done in the crash courses and was also available in your drives if you see and watch them carefully. Okay, understood this? Clear? So, कटना तो है ही है स्टेट्स का, चाहे ऐसे या वैसे, कटना तो है ही है. So legislative councils are also a very interesting example, a very interesting example of what is called center-state relations and rule number 2. Okay, understood this, right? Done. ये तो simple examples हो गए. Now let us take complicated examples, right? Let us say we are talking about all India services. These include the IAS, the police services, and the Indian forest services. Indian forest services. Okay? Forest services. Now, all India services are recruited by the center, finally removed by the center, but they work at the states. They work as deputations to state cadre. In fact, it is the state cadres which pay for your training at Labasana. You are like a stereotypical patriarchal Indian bride, unfortunately, that the center is your Maika, but your real home is in the states. So you are getting readied for your tenure in your sasural, which is your states. You are getting ready for your tenure in your sasural, which is called your states. And before your grand send-off happens, we arrange a nice little grand big fat wedding for you, and that is called the foundation course at Labasana, so that you feel that you're a part of all India, but in reality you are going to spend most of your time in your respective state cadres. And only if the state cadres release you can you come and work at the center, and that is also after 10 years of service at the respective states. Okay, but you are primarily an officer of the states. Now you understand, the states did not want this. The states did not want this. They have their own state public service commissions. They have their own state service officers who are SDMs, DMs and so on and so forth. You are going to become an SDM as an All India Service Officer, and your state services officer is most likely going to end his or her career as a DM. They will retire at the DM ship, and you will most likely start your career as an SDM, then moving on to a DM. Right? Understood this? So very interesting. Very interesting. Now this means the very concept of All India services is the center stronger than the states. That the center is recruiting a bunch of officers and compulsorily sending those officers to the states. It's compulsorily sending those officers to the states. And the states have no choice but to accept those officers. No state in India can say, I do not want these officers. I do not want All India services. I do not want IS officers in my state. States don't have a choice. That means the center is stronger than the states. Now, the candy is, if you want to increase or decrease an All India service, then it can only be done through a law made by the parliament. But for the parliament to make that law, it is the Rajya Sabha who has to authorize the parliament to make that law. And this can only be done through a special majority. One, we've discussed this. The Rajya Sabha is going to authorize the parliament, is going to authorize himself, herself and the parliament that yes, let us make this happen. Let us is going to authorize itself and the Lok Sabha and therefore collectively the Parliament and say, let us make this happen. Let us create a new All India services. I as the Rajya Sabha is going to authorize the Parliament. Why the Rajya Sabha? Because the Rajya Sabha is a representative of the states and All India services are going to affect state interests. States are again very proud that we get to decide what All India service will exist in the country and what exists when what will not exist. If you've done your current affairs right, you would know that All India Judicial Services has already been sanctioned by the Rajya Sabha. Now where is the problem? The problem is just because the Rajya Sabha has said yes, it does not mean that the Parliament as a whole will have to necessarily vote on it. And it also does not mean that it is definitely going to happen because this will still have to be passed by the Lok Sabha. And then once the Rajya Sabha has authorized it, that okay, let us have All India Judicial Services, then you will have All India Judicial Services Bill, Lok Sabha will pass it, then Rajya Sabha will also pass it, or Rajya Sabha will pass it, Lok Sabha will pass it. And Lok Sabha is a game of central political majority. So unless the Lok Sabha really wants, unless the government really wants, you cannot really make any difference to All India services. You are just creating a permission. But the final decision cannot be taken unless both the houses have agreed. And Lok Sabha is a central political majority, right? So an advanced application of federal balance. Okay, an advanced application of federal balance. I'll give you a final example, and this is also a very interesting example, very logical example. You see, the governor is even worse off than you All India service officers. The governor is recruited by the center, is removed by the center, and here you have to sometimes not work for the states, but governor always permanently works at a specific state. The governor by definition is a center stronger than state office. The center gets to decide. The president on the advice of the Council of Ministers decides who's going to become a governor in what state. There are no qualifications. There is no procedure for removal of the governor. As long as the governor gets to please the center, the governor gets to remain the governor. So, center stronger than the states. Now imagine that we are having a post-constitution after party. On the 26th of January 1950, after we have done everything that we could, then we are having a late night after party. Everybody's partying, right? Of course, our Prime Minister Pandit Nehru is upset because some foreign dignitaries are leaving the country and he is upset about it, right? And everybody's partying, right? Now, of course, Ambedkar is sitting in one corner, he's enjoying the show. He's like, yeah, I've created the constitution, so everybody's going to dance to the tunes of the document that I have created. Everybody's having a gala time. Then, Pandit Nehru says, call the president and calls all the states together. He said, come, I want to talk to you. Firstly, thank you for becoming a part of India by hook or by crook. And you see this man is the president of India. I'm going to send a local version of this man with you after this party as a return gift. And the states are like, I don't want a return gift. This return gift is called governor. I'm going to send this governor with each of you as a state. And this governor is going to be appointed by me, removed by me, will work as per my directions, and this governor is going to have certain powers with respect to you. If the governor thinks that you are not doing your job properly, the governor can inform me and I can impose a president's rule in your state and I can shut down your legislatures. Any bill that the governor wants to pass can reserve and send it to my guy in the center called the president, and it is absolutely up to the governor. The states are crying. They have tears. कि ये ऐसे कैसे? आपने तो बोला था इंडिया बिलोंग्स टू स्टेट्स, वल्लभ भाई पटेल ने भी बोला था कि सब साथ साथ में रहेंगे, ये ऐसे नहीं चलेगा, नहीं नहीं. Then Ambedkar comes. Ambedkar says, come here, don't worry. Nehru is upset, he doesn't understand what he's saying. Come here, I'll tell you. I've written the constitution, no, I'll tell you that the governor, as per the constitution, has more powers than the president. And this is actually true. The governor has more powers than the president. In fact, the constitution clearly gives the governor more discretionary powers than the president. States are then rubbing, like, सच्ची मेरे वाले के पास आपके वाले से ज्यादा पावर है. हाँ पावर है, बहुत पावर है. States are again very happy, beaming with pride, celebrating to glory. And then they go back home. They don't realize what has happened to them. Because the governor has been appointed by the president on the advice of the Council of Ministers. Whatever discretionary powers the governor is going to use will never be against the center. The second the governor starts using discretionary powers against the center will remove the governor. So agreed that governor has more discretionary powers, but those powers can never be used against the center. And that is your step number 3, ladies and gentlemen. A simple application of the second rule which makes you understand how it works. Okay, a simple application of the second rule which makes you understand how it works. Alright, this is called the federal balance, and the balance is tilted in the favor of the center. Okay, the balance is tilted in the favor of the center. Alright, understood this? Are we clear with this? This is rule number 2. This is your federal balance. Okay, this is rule number 2. This is your federal balance. Alright, okay, clear? Okay. All right. Excellent. Thank you, Jay Kumar. Now, we move to the third and the fourth rule, which I told you we are going to be discussing together. Okay. We now move to the third and the fourth rule, which we are going to be discussing together. Okay. So let us see what it is that we are talking about. The third rule is separation of powers. The fourth rule is checks and balances. Okay. Now, let's understand this firstly through an unrelated example, and then we will of course understand it through polity. Right? Now, forget about the law. Any company that you would have heard of, right? Any company that you would have heard of would usually have 3 departments: the manufacturing, or the product department, you will have a sales slash marketing department, and you will have your admin, HR, legal department, right? Admin, HR, legal department, right? Thank you, Yogendra. Thank you. ठीक है? Admin, HR, legal, the MIN behind the admin might be hidden behind the logo, but it says admin, okay? All right. Now, all of these three believe they are the most important for the company. The manufacturing guys or the product team believes that if we are not developing a product, what are they going to sell? Who are they going to administer? Because the company will go bankrupt if they not have anything to sell. The sales and marketing team believes that, boss, we are why people are buying the product. We are creating a hype. Let's say this company is Apple, okay? A $1 trillion company, by the way, is in trouble because your iPhone sales might be a lot, but they really haven't grown since 2015. So while all of us might think Apple is the richest company and all of that, but it is not really growing at the pace it should be. The average sales for the iPhone are more or less the same. Anyways, so the product team of the iPhone says, we are creating a product that is going to revolutionize the mobile industry. If we don't create it, what are you going to sell? What is the administrative, the HR and the legal team going to fight about? We are why the iPhone exists, because we create the iPhone. The sales and the marketing team says, what nonsense? We create the hype around the iPhone. We tell the people this is the fastest iPhone ever. We tell people this is the fastest processor in a smartphone ever. We put 4 cameras, 3 cameras, tele-wide, this wide, that wide, narrow wide lens. So that people who are stupid think that they need to get the latest iPhone because that will make them a better photographer. No. Photography skills make you a better photographer. Camera doesn't make you a good photographer. So people all over the world are selling their kidneys, are selling their brains to buy the latest iPhone. Okay. And then the admin, HR and the admin and the HR and the legal team says, boss, we are why you are able to exist. We are why you are able to exist. We hire you. If we don't hire you, you don't exist here. If we don't win the patent suits, we don't win the copyright suits, you will not be able to manufacture these. You will not be able to sell these. So everybody believes that they are the most important and real power lies with them. Okay, real power lies with them. Alright, this is also true in Hindu mythology. This is also true in Hindu mythology, where, for example, Brahma, Vishnu and Shiv or Mahesh, they're basically the same thing. Each of the three, in their own ways, are the most important and the most powerful. Brahma is the creator, like how product teams are the creator. Vishnu is the executor, how sales and marketing execute it. And Shiv is the destroyer, right? Shiv is the destroyer, how legal teams are the destroyer, right? Are the destroyer. Clear? Each of them believe they're extremely important. Each of them believe that they're very, very important. And each of them are the three power centers of the Hindu religion. Similarly, in a company, these are the three power centers. So every time the product team is upset, both of them have to go console the product team. Every time
The marketing team is upset. Both of them have to go convince the market team and so on and so forth. Every time Shivji gets upset and starts dancing, right? He dances when he gets upset. Both of them have to go to Shivji. Says, please stop dancing. The world will come to an end. If this is true for a company, this is true for mythology, it is also true for polity, ladies and gentlemen. And the three power centers in polity are legislature, who's the creator, executive, who's the executor or the implementer, and the judiciary, who's the destroyer of bad law, who's the arbitrator of decisions. ये तीनों को लगता है कि हमसे ज़्यादा इम्पोर्टेंट कोई नहीं है. लेजिस्लेचर को लगता है कि भाई मैं नहीं तो कानून, कानून नहीं तो तू इम्प्लीमेंट क्या करेगा. जब कानून नहीं है तो तू बताएगा क्या कि कौन सा सही कानून है, कौन सा खराब कानून है. एग्जीक्यूटिव बोलेगा बेटा मेरे बिना तुम कानून बना ही नहीं सकते, तो तुम कानून बना ही नहीं सकते, मेरे बिना तुम कानून इम्प्लीमेंट ही नहीं कर सकते, तो बना के क्या कर लोगे. जुडिशरी बोलता अगर मैं ना रहूं तो तुम देश बेचाओ, तुम लोगों के सर पे नाच लो, तुम कुछ भी कानून बना लो. Right? So this is, ladies and gentlemen, the origin of separation of powers. This is what is called your thank you, right? So the origin of separation of powers. Okay. So what we are going to now be talking largely about, is legislature, executive and judiciary. Okay. So separation of powers means L, E and J. Now, that is the first concept we've understood. Now comes the basic concept. You remember when we were in school, we all used to be divided into houses and we used to have inter-house competitions. You know, red house, green house, blue house, yellow house, red house. है ना ऐसे करके. These inter-house competitions were also called intra-school competitions. And of course, we had inter-school competitions. So you had something inter-school and you had something intra-school. Correct? The same thing also applies here. So the basic discussion here is that separation of powers means two things. Inter-separation of powers. It also means intra-separation of powers. Checks and balances also means two things. Inter-checks and balances and intra-checks and balances. That school that we were talking about, this is school 1, this is school 2, this is school 3. So inter-school means separation of powers between L, E and J. Checks and balances means L, E and J keeping a check on one another. That is inter. Intra means inside L. For example, Lok Sabha, Rajya Sabha. Inside E, that is elected executive, permanent executive, which is nothing but Mantri and Babu. And judiciary means Supreme Court, High Court and other courts. Bas. So, inter-separation of powers and inter-checks and balances is between L, E and J, and intra means inside L, inside E, inside J. Inside L, inside E and inside J. ठीक है? पक्का नितिन, पक्का. ठीक है? So, let's take some examples. For example, the conduct of a judge, of a Supreme Court judge, for example, cannot be discussed on the floor of the parliament. The conduct of a Supreme Court judge cannot be discussed on the floor of the parliament unless, of course, you're removing the judge. Ordinary cases you can't. What is this? This is because of inter-separation of powers. A Supreme Court judge can only be removed by the parliament. जज को सिर्फ पार्लियामेंट निकाल सकता है. दिस इज नथिंग बट इंटर checks and balances. Right? Similarly, except for ministers, Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha MPs, except for ministers, Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha MPs can only sit in the houses they belong. In the houses they belong. लोक सभा वाले राज्यसभा हाउस में जाके ऐसे नहीं बैठ सकते कि वहां इंटरनेट आ रहा है मजे करेंगे. Only ministers can sit in a house they don't belong because they're accountable, but nobody else is. They belong. This is nothing but intra separation of powers. Right? The judgments of the Supreme Court are binding on all lower courts. This is nothing but intra checks and balances. है ना? बस कितने एग्जाम्पल्स हैं, ऐसा भतेरे एग्जाम्पल्स हैं. And sometimes a combination of two rules will apply. The Lok Sabha can override the Rajya Sabha when it comes to a money bill. ये हम पढ़ेंगे. A combination of rule number 2, center stronger than the states, and intra checks and balances. This part. The elected executive decides the tenure of the permanent executive. Intra checks and balances. Both the Supreme Court and the High Courts have powers to regulate their own procedure, to have their own procedural requirements. This is nothing but intra-separation of powers. Right? So almost everything can be explained through these basic 4 rules. Almost everything can be explained through these basic 4 rules. आप पॉलिटी में कुछ भी उठा दीजिए. Emergency. Emergencies are an application of rule number 2, center stronger than the states, and rule number 1, democratic mandate. That is why the parliament has to authorize an emergency. An emergency is issued by the center against the states. कुछ भी आप preamble से लेके 12वें शेड्यूल तक कुछ भी उठा दीजिए, यही 4 रूल्स हैं, यही लगते हैं. They explain the why to you. They explain why something happens to you in the reason that it does, in the context that it does. Anything beyond it is particularly not relevant. ठीक है? Understood? Clear? Okay. So these are your 4 golden rules, and now with these 4 golden rules, our theme number 1 and all the ingredients of theme number 1 is complete. You can check the listing of the topics for theme number 1 and you will be able to tell me that theme number 1 has been completed. You can take a 5-minute break, just go through theme number 1 and then we will begin with theme number 2 after the 5-minute break. One hour is up. You can take your eyes off the screen as well. Okay? Understood? ठीक है. We will cover constitutional morality and fundamental rights, don't worry. Economic classification, as said, we'll cover it in the context of the preamble. Be patient. Alright. Now let's cover the rest. Now let's move to theme number 2. Now let us move to theme number 2. In theme number 2, we are going to be covering a selection of 3 topics. They are topic 1, the preamble, topic 2, territory, and topic 3, citizenship. In a very limited capacity, territory and citizenship have some correlation with each other, but preamble is an isolated topic per se, does not have a lot of ramifications in a very large extent to territory and citizenship, but a very limited application to territory. Now, we are going to cover topic 1 as the preamble, and let us identify the outline of topic 1, which is the preamble. Okay, so let us start. The sound is not low. I can check. I think it's perfectly fine. Chitramali, it might be a problem from your end, not mine per se. Okay. All right. So outline. Layer 1, which is conceptual and factual, and therefore important for the prelims, and layer 2, which is analysis oriented and therefore important for the mains. What is it that we should be studying as far as the exam is concerned? All right? Okay. First, we must understand the historical context of the preamble. Then we must very clearly, as much as we can, understand the meanings of key words in the preamble. We must understand the additions that were made to the preamble later, and then we must understand the legal status of the preamble. See, in the prelims, there are broadly 2 kinds of questions that are asked from the preamble. First, the features of the preamble and the meanings of key words of the preamble, and by features we look at the characteristics or the the explanation to the nature of the preamble per se. Now, as far as the means is concerned, there has been one direct question explaining the relevance of certain keywords, and one of the other ways that the preamble can be used is when you are trying to study when you are trying to understand or you are trying to study and you are supposed to write introductions or conclusions in your mains answers. How in economics the RBI is the lender of the last resort. In GS paper 2, the preamble is the introduction or the conclusion of the last resort. So for example, let us say you're writing an answer on secularism and you're not able to figure out an appropriate conclusion or an introduction. You can always say, if it is the introduction, you can say, the preamble of India guides us to be a secular state, or the conclusion must be that our policies must conform to the ideals and aspirations as mentioned in the preamble of the Indian Constitution. So this becomes your introduction and conclusion of the last resort. Please do not use the preamble in the same answer as an introduction or a conclusion. You can use it in separate answers of the same paper, that is fine. But you will not use it in the same answer. That would be a colossal mistake. Okay? So that is important. This is something that you must know. And these are the broad kind of things that are asked in the pre. These are the broad kind of things that are asked in the mains. Okay? Now what we are going to do is, we are going to understand all of this in a fair amount of detail, and we will see how this has to be done. Now, what I am going to do is, I am going to present the preamble in front of you. Okay? So you can always do this by yourself. So you can open the preamble of India and you can go to images, right? And you can find the best high definition image of the preamble, right? So for example, let us say we take this image. Now we'll have to check the dimensions of this image. So that it's easy and it is visible to everybody. Preamble of India HD. Okay, so let us say we take this for example. Yes, this seems like a very, very good image. So we are going to save image on the desktop. Save. Okay. I hope everybody is able to see this now clearly. Okay. Excellent. Now this is the preamble of India. This is what we are going to be referring to. This is the actual text of the Preamble of India. Okay, so let us start and let's figure this out. All right. So, the Preamble of India. Let me give you certain keywords here. First, let's read it together. We, the people of India, having solemnly resolved to constitute India into a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic, and to secure to all its citizens justice, social, economic, and political, liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith, and worship, equality of status and of opportunity, and to promote among them all fraternity, ensuring the dignity of the individual and the unity and the integrity of the nation. Okay? Now, in our 26th, in our Constituent Assembly, on the 26th day of November 1949, we hereby adopt, enact, and give to ourselves this Constitution of India. Now, let's look at what all do we need to understand, how do we need to understand from the preamble. Okay, first, the first line, we the people of India, having solemnly resolved to constitute India into a, and you stop here. This part and basically the preamble has 4 parts. This is the first part, this is the second part, this is the third part, and this is the fourth part. Okay, so the first part and the fourth part must be understood together. So the first part, we the people of India, and the historical context here in our Constituent Assembly on the 26th November is supposed to be studied together. Okay, then the second part, then the third part. Now let's understand. The first part explains us two very specific things. First, it tells us through we the people that the people of the country are the ultimate sovereign of the country. अगर एग्जाम में गलती से आ जाए प्री में, who is the ultimate sovereign? The people are the ultimate sovereign. This is reaffirmation of the social contract that we had understood from our classes. Okay, we the people. And the fourth part also teaches us what is called the historical context to the preamble and gives us an insight into the legal status of the preamble. Okay, the legal status of the preamble. Now, the second part are essentially words that describe the country as a whole. Words that describe the country as a whole. The third part describe aspirations for the people of the country, for the citizens of the country. Okay, for the citizens of the country. So, these are aspirations for the country, these are aspirations for the citizens. Now, in the prelims and in the mains, it is very defined. For example, mostly you will see mains questions from here, and mostly you will see prelims questions from here. Okay, prelims questions from here, and liberty is UPSC's favorite because this is also being used in Article 21. So we'll come to that later when we'll come to that. Okay, so broadly this is how the preamble has been set up. Okay, now we've understood the meaning of we the people of India. Now let us spend some time on the last part of the preamble where we must understand the legal context or the historical context of the preamble. So, as you would know that there is something called a dictatorship and there is something called colonialism. There's something called dictatorship and there is something called colonialism. The basic difference is dictatorship is primarily an internal concept, whereas colonialism is an external concept, wherein a foreign power a foreign power is occupying India or any other country. So when dictatorship has to end, democracy has to be restored, it is done internally. But when colonial power has to end, this requires what is called a transfer of power. A transfer of power from the colonial masters to something. So when the Britishers decide to leave us, they have to leave us in the hands of something, of someone. And this has to be done through a process of law. This has to be done through a process of law. And the law which gave India its independence is called the Indian Independence Act. It is called the Indian Independence Act, which was passed in the British Parliament. At that time, the British Prime Minister was Clement Attlee. It is the Indian Independence Act of 1947, which was transferring the power from the British regime to Indians. Now, to Indians means what? Now, we had something called the Constituent Assembly. This Constituent Assembly was responsible to basically draft the constitution, which is going to regulate the country for eternity and times to come. And this Constituent Assembly will also be an interim parliament, and we are also going to have an interim government as a part of the interim parliament until we have our first fresh elections in 1952. So we've got so many years here to figure out exactly what is going to happen. Right? Understood this? Correct? So that's the basic example of how this has to be done. What are the basic procedures around it? Right? Now, the Constituent Assembly primary purpose, they had a constituent committee, they had a drafting committee. The drafting committee was headed, of course, by Ambedkar, and the Constitution Committee was headed by Nehru. Okay, the drafting committee of the Constitution and the Constitution Committee are two very different things. The Constitution Committee was headed by Nehru, and the drafting committee of the Constitution was headed by Ambedkar. And what basically happened was that on, this is the date, on 26th November 1949, the entire text, the final draft of the Constitution was ready. Okay, it was ready. But it does not mean that it has to necessarily be enforced from the 26th of November 1949. We wanted a more symbolic, a more prestigious date, and we wanted to ready the country to accept the new constitution. So it was thought that the constitution will fully come into force on 26th January 1950, and that's the basic difference. On 26th November 1949, the constitution's final draft was accepted and adopted by the country, by the Constituent Assembly. But it was on 26th January 1950 that all articles of the Constitution were put into force. There were a few articles that came into force before 1950 also, but they are not relevant as far as your UPSC syllabus is concerned. This is not a state services exam. They are never going to ask you which articles came into force before 1950. But the articles, all articles of the constitution were enforceable, came into force from the 26th of January 1950. And why was 26th January 1950 chosen as the date? It is because on 26th January 1929, in the Congress session at Lahore, India for the first time demanded complete independence. Now, already the date of independence was taken and India was declared independent on 15th August 1947. We understand that. That date was taken. But we also wanted to give symbolism and better preparedness to another date. So that is why 26th January 1950 is today popularly called as the Republic Day. Has nothing to do with the original definition of republic, which means that the head of the state is an elected one and not a hereditary one. We understand that, but it is to basically celebrate that from the 26th of January 1950, the constitution in its entirety would be applicable to the country. Okay, understood this? And that is the basic explanation, the historical context. Okay, now that's the basic timeline, that's the basic need. And the preamble was inserted to the constitution on the insistence of Pandit Nehru in a speech that he had given in the Constituent Assembly, and the speech contained something called the Objectives Resolution. Basically, aspirations of the kind of country that we wanted to build. So, in our Constituent Assembly, on the 26th day of November 1949, we adopt, enact and give to ourselves, which means we pass the constitution, but the constitution is going to be enforceable from a later date, and that is perfectly possible. Any law can be passed today and can be brought into force from a later date, right? So it was passed on 26th January 19, it was passed on 26th November 1949, but all articles were not implemented from that day. But all the articles that had to be implemented and that should be implemented were properly being implemented from 26th January 1950. Okay, that's when the constitution is enforced. 26th November 1949 is where the constitution is enacted and adopted, and 26th January 1950 is where the constitution is enforced. So that we don't forget 26th November, we remember it as Constitutional Day or Law Day. Okay, so that's the basic historical context that you may be asked in the exam. Anything more than this is not going to be needed as far as the exam is concerned, right? So this is a historical context, that this is nothing but a celebration of transfer of power, and in colonialism, power has to be transferred from the colonial masters to something. You just can't randomly leave India. You have to leave India in the hands of a legitimate authority, and that was the Constituent Assembly, which then got converted to the interim parliament. We had an interim government, and then we had the first set of fresh elections in 1952, where Nehru became the first Prime Minister, right? And the Independence Act, which was passed by British, it was a British law which granted independence to India on 15th August 1947, which basically means that we are going to be looking at three sets of dates. 15th August 1947, we became independent. On 26th January 1949, we passed the final text, the final draft of the Constitution. On 26th January 1950, the Constitution becomes an applicable law in India. Okay? This is the basic historical context. And the preamble, which was added to the Constitution, was added because it was a part of a speech which was delivered by Nehru in the Constituent Assembly, and the speech was called the Objectives Resolution. So it was added to the Constitution, to the final text of the Constitution, before 26th November 1949, Because you wanted to start the constitution from a vision, right? If you, for example, whenever you read about a company always has a vision that this is what we want to do, right? For example, whenever you start preparing for this exam, you have a vision that I want to prepare for this exam for X, Y, Z reasons, and I'm going to go about this through ABC ways. That is your vision for this exam. Similarly, the preamble is also the vision of the constitution. An insight, like whenever you open a book, every book is going to have a preface. That what is the book about? What is the book trying to convey to you? Similarly, what is the constitution trying to convey to you is reflected in the preamble. That हमारा देश कैसा हो, हमारा देश ऐसा हो. और ये हमने preamble में सबको लिख के बताया है. ठीक है? Understood this? Now, the important parts, now comes the important part as far as the exam is concerned. Now, please listen to me as carefully as you can, because this is important. A lot of times in the prelims exam, you get a question, which of the following best describe the preamble, right? Which of the following best describe the preamble? Now, the best way to do this, and there is a simple trick behind it, whatever word they are referring to, if that word is not legally substantive, it cannot be legally defined, then that word best describes the preamble. जैसे कि vision of the constitution, soul of the constitution, heartbeat of the constitution, pulse of the constitution, the mind of the makers of the constitution. ये सब क्या है? These are not legally defined. You can't legally define the mind of the makers. You can't legally define the vision. You can't legally define the pulse, the heart, the soul of the constitution. So all of these are usually referred to as the preamble's adjectives. तो कई बार प्री में ये भी सवाल आते हैं. Questions that ask you which of the following best describe the preamble, और अगर ऐसे कुछ option है, that will be the right answer. So one of the kind of questions that you are asked are on the nature of the preamble, the features of the preamble, which include the adjectives of the preamble. And therefore, one of the adjectives of the preamble is specifically this. One of the objectives of the preamble is specifically this. Okay? A simple way to go about it. Now, there is a very simple way to memorize the terms of the preamble. Okay. Now, when we look at country-specific terms, right? Sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic. You may remember of a term in economics called special drawing rights, SDR, which are used in the context of the IMF, and they represent the amount of money a country can withdraw from the IMF dependent on the contributions to the IMF. Similarly, these are also arranged in that way. SDR, Sovereign, Socialist, Secular, Democratic Republic. So S cube DR, Sovereign, Socialist, Secular, Democratic Republic. ठीक है? Sovereign, Socialist, Secular, Democratic Republic. And if you see, they've been arranged in a logical fashion. कि पहले तो भैया देश आज़ाद रहे, उसके बाद हम सबकी मदद करेंगे, सबको सब धर्म चलने की आज़ादी है. We are going to have a democracy and our president is not going to be a hereditary one. बस. So sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic. ये रटा होना चाहिए. S cube DR. ठीक है? S cube DR ये रटा होना चाहिए. Clear? Understood? Then you have words with respect to citizens. करने का बड़ा simple तरीका है, which is nothing but JALEFU. An acronym for this is JALEFU. Justice, liberty, equality, fraternity and unity and integrity. ठीक है? Justice, liberty, equality, fraternity and unity and integrity. तो unity से हम JALEFU कर लेते. ठीक है? Justice, liberty, equality, fraternity and unity. Therefore, it represents what is called the citizen-centric words. ठीक है? अब the country-specific words, they are usually asked in the mains exam. For example, in one of the previous year questions in the last 10 years, the mains exam had asked you, explain the words attached to the words preamble, attached to the word republic, and are they justified in the current context. मतलब sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic, क्या हम सच्ची में sovereign हैं, क्या हम सच्ची में secular हैं, क्या हम सच्ची में socialist हैं, क्या हम सच्ची में democratic हैं. आज के टाइम पे इनका मीनिंग क्या होता है. ऐसे सवाल मेंस में आएंगे बिकॉज ये एब्स्ट्रैक्ट नहीं है. मेंस में आपसे कभी एब्स्ट्रैक्ट सवाल नहीं पूछेंगे दैट व्हाट इज जस्टिस एज पर द इंडियन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन, व्हाट इज इक्वालिटी एज पर द इंडियन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन. ये ज्यादातर जस्टिस, लिबर्टी, इक्वालिटी, फ्रेटर्निटी यू विल गेट इन द प्रीलिम्स. व्हिच ऑफ द फॉलोइंग इज द बेस्ट इंटरप्रिटेशन ऑफ लिबर्टी, इज द बेस्ट इंटरप्रिटेशन ऑफ इक्वालिटी और फ्रेटर्निटी. ठीक है. यहाँ पे बहुत गलतियाँ करते हैं बच्चे, which is why I often recommend that please read your democratic politics and Indian constitution at work as NCRTs, because these are political theory and Indian constitution at work as NCRTs, because they have exact meanings of these which can be verbatim picked up by the UPSC. So जब भी UPSC लिबर्टी वगैरह पे क्वेश्चन उठाता है तो यहीं से उठाता है, लाइन बाय लाइन लेके उठाता है, बिना लेफ्ट राइट देखे हुए. क्लियर. सो दिस इज व्हाट हैज टू बी कवर्ड एज फार एज जस्टिस, लिबर्टी, इक्वालिटी एंड फ्रेटर्निटी इज कंसर्न. ओके. अब we are going to spend some time on country specific words, then we are going to spend some time on citizen specific words, understand which were added later, and we'll be able to analyze them, and then we'll move to the legal status. ठीक है. And then we'll of course move to the legal status. ठीक है. So let us start. Now we are going to be looking at the preamble, and we're going to be looking at words specifically with respect to the country. Okay. The first is sovereignty. आपने ये ध्यान दिया होगा. The first is sovereignty. Okay. Sovereignty. Now, what do we need to know? We need to know three things. First, what is the meaning of sovereignty? We need to know what is the meaning of sovereignty. Second, how has sovereignty evolved over time? And third, in the current or the contemporary context, how is India sovereign? What makes us sovereign? ठीक है. As long as we are able to answer these three questions, whether it is the pre or the mains, we will be able to answer all of this effectively. Okay. So let us start. All right. Just give me 2 minutes. I just need to have a glass of water and come back. Just give me 2 minutes. Alright, so let's understand the meaning of sovereignty, right? Now, sovereignty basically means, now if in the prelims by mistake the UPSC asks you, you have to look for an option which is closest to this word, which is freedom from external influence. Freedom from external influence. Okay. The meaning of sovereignty is freedom from external influence. ठीक है. Now, मतलब बेसिकली आज़ादी. हमें कोई कुछ नहीं कह सकता कि हमें क्या करना चाहिए और क्या नहीं करना चाहिए. Right? Now, of course, when we look at it from an evolutionary perspective, we've understood that sovereignty has evolved from the basic notions of independence to interdependence as we live in a globalized world, we live in an interdependent world, we live in a geopolitically active world, and there's absolutely no country in the world which can survive absolutely on its own without collaborating with other fellow nations of the world. So the notions of sovereignty today have a very different meaning altogether, from independence to interdependence, and whether it is environment or resources or human rights or trade or agriculture or piracy, anything, or technology, we live in a very interdependent world. That is why we must understand the contemporary notions of sovereignty. Right? Now, one of the first contemporary notions of sovereignty has to do with territorial sovereignty, right? With respect to territorial sovereignty. Now, of course, you have your land border and all that, but in the modern day today, when we look at trade, when we look at international cooperation, we understand that India is, for example, a part of the UN Convention on Laws of the Sea, where we are a part of a global partnership which recognizes exclusive economic zones, we recognize intercontinental zones, and so on and so forth. So territory today is not just a physical land boundary, we are looking at larger notions of territory, looking at larger notions of international cooperation. So that's one interpretation of sovereignty, right? The second interpretation of sovereignty, as we look at it, is, for example, from a geopolitical context, right? We look at it from a geopolitical context, from a international relations context, from a context of what is called say diplomacy, right? Now let's understand this. For example, all of you would have heard of several UN agencies, international agencies. They're basically international dialogue forums, right? Suppose, for example, we are talking about the UN General Assembly, right? For example, we are talking about the UN General Assembly, right? Now, suppose, let us say today, all countries of the world have gathered at the UN General Assembly, and we are discussing on, say, terrorism and how we must have a standard operating procedure to deal with people who are in custody for terrorist activities. Now, all the countries will come together and they will draft what is called a document, right? This document, for example, will say define terrorism and will define some human rights protocols that all nations must follow with respect to dealing with terror suspects. Now, every country is an independent country. A UN is basically an international parliament. So, in the international parliament called the UN or the General Assembly of the UN, each country, right, can either say yes, can either say no, and can also abstain. But interestingly, you can say yes in two ways. Like, oh yes, this is a great idea, we must definitely do it. Now, this is called ratification. This is called ratification. Now, when a country ratifies an international document, the country says, I am going to come back home and I am going to implement the international document at home. I'm going to make changes in my domestic law, set up institutions if I have to, but I will make sure that I implement this basic document. Okay? Clear on this? So that's the first part. The second part is a country can be like, okay, good idea, I'll let it be. It is called a signatory. Now, a signatory means very good idea, but I am not going to implement it at this moment. I don't have the resources or the will or the need to do so. And every country has the choice to either ratify or be a signatory or say no or even abstain from voting on that document. कि हमको करना ही नहीं है इसमें, हाँ ना की झंझट में ही नहीं पड़ना है. And this is modern day sovereignty. For example, India has chosen to ratify a few things it wanted to, has chosen to ratify a few things it did not want to. So, for example, let us say when we were looking at ratification, India said, you know what? There is an old UN convention called the UN Convention Against Corruption, which said you should not only criminalize the acceptance of bribes, you should also criminalize the offer of bribes. The demand and the supply of corruption both should be criminal. India ratified this convention, and a few years ago we made changes to our Prevention of Corruption Act, and today not only is it illegal to accept a bribe in India, it is also illegal to offer a bribe in India. Not only is it illegal to accept a bribe in India, it is also illegal to offer a bribe in India. Okay? And therefore, this becomes a simple application of what is called ratification. But, for example, there is an international document called ICCPR, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. India, one of the there is schedules to a constitution, there are protocols to documents. One of the protocol is on death penalty. Now, India has only ratified it. India has not been is only a signatory to it. I'm sorry, has not ratified it. This document wanted all countries to abolish the practice of death penalty, that courts should not award death penalty to anybody. But India said, I am not going to do this right away. We are not ready for it. So that is why in India, death penalty is perfectly legal, absolutely perfectly legal, no problem at all, no issues at all, right? Similarly, India has never ratified the nuclear non-proliferation treaties because we wanted to develop our nuclear capabilities. For example, we ratified the Rio Declaration and said, yes, we must have the National Green Tribunal as a dedicated environment redressal agency. The idea is the choice remains with us. The idea is the choice remains with us and it should always remain with us. That's the idea. That's the basic explanation. That is how it has to be done. So there are several geopolitical ways that we had to go about it from a contemporary point of view, right? There's a geopolitical implication. Then there is also a technological implication nowadays, right? For example, when we look at the data protection bill, one of the things that we are talking about with respect to data protection is data localization. I mean, if you think about it, your Amazon data is stored on Amazon web servers which are based out of Ireland, which are based out of countries that are outside. Now India says the data of Indian users on Amazon must be on Amazon servers based out of India. So India is deciding what its definition of sovereignty is. Alright? So this is how sovereignty is used, is translated in the modern day contemporary form. So if in the mains they ask you, your answer is going to be that India's sovereignty today, as a concluding statement, is that it is today driven by national interest, is today driven by what is called national interest. So geopolitical could mean two things. It could mean multilateral and it could also mean bilateral. For example, India decides who they want to support and when they want to support. For example, India, who is the champion of human rights, will never vote against Israel on issues in the UN where the UN wants to take action against Israel for Israeli sponsored violence in Palestine. Right? We'll never want to do that. We'll never ever want to do that because of the partnerships, military, agricultural. We buy Pegasus also from Israel. So those are reasons. Similarly, because of our old historic ties with Russia, we buy aircraft carriers, we buy a lot of defense equipment from Russia. And when the world was questioning Russia, when the world was questioning Russia on Russian involvement in the Crimean withdrawal from Ukraine and annexation of Crimea to Russia, India said it is Russia's internal matter. But when it comes to environment, the Paris Action Agenda, right, the COP26, India has fought with the developed world, said no, the developed world has polluted the world more than the developing world has. So they have a larger responsibility to pay for their deeds and undo the damage that they have caused to the developing world. So sovereignty today is a beautifully changing concept, right? It's a beautifully changing concept, right? Understood this? So sovereignty means the freedom from external influence. It has evolved from basic notions of independence to interdependence. There are three basic ramifications of sovereignty: territorial, geopolitical, which means two things, multilateral and bilateral, and technological. And then you can conclude by saying today's sovereignty is based on the notions of national interest. Today's sovereignty is based on the notions of national interest. इतने में आपका प्री का मसाला, इतने में आपका मेंस का मसाला बहुत है. You can keep adding this. Like for example, the sanctions, the exceptions that have been given to India on the S-400 missile deal, right, is an element of India's sovereignty, is an element of bilateral relations between India and the US. So ये सारी चीज़ें हैं, इनको ऐसे करना है. Understood? So to keep adding examples from current affairs and making our answers better, right? इतना international pressure था that India should militarily get involved in Afghanistan. India did not. India chose the wait and watch policy, right? India decides to be a member of the Quad, right? Despite international pressure, India still says Kashmir is a bilateral issue. It is not an international issue. We will decide what is right according to us as far as Kashmir is concerned. India doesn't even find the Galwan Valley issue an issue because it is territorially a part of India. दुनिया जाए भाड़ में, जो बोलना है जिसको बोले, ये हमारा एरिया है, right? So this is what is called sovereignty, right? Freedom from external influence has evolved from independence to interdependence. Today has three ramifications: टेरिटोरियल, जियोपॉलिटिकल एंड टेक्नोलॉजिकल. आप इसमें इकोनॉमिक भी डाल सकते हैं, इसमें आप ह्यूमन राइट्स करके भी डाल सकते हैं, एंड यू कैन राइट इट फ्रॉम बायलैटरल एंड मल्टीलैटरल पर्सपेक्टिव्स, गिव एग्जांपल्स ऑफ दिस एंड देन कंक्लूड बाय सेइंग today's sovereignty has evolved from justice to the notions of national interest, कि जो हमारे देश के हित में है हम वो करेंगे. माना कि हम पे इजराइल का प्रेशर है और हम इजराइल के खिलाफ नहीं बोलेंगे, लेकिन वो प्रेशर हमने लिया है. इजराइल से मिलिट्री इक्विपमेंट हमने खरीदा है, एग्रीकल्चरल कोऑपरेशन हमने दिया है. तो अगर हमें उसके कॉन्टेक्स्ट में कुछ करना पड़ेगा तो हम करेंगे. देयर आर नो टू डाउट्स अबाउट इट, देयर आर नो टू क्वेश्चंस अबाउट इट. ठीक है. So that is the larger explanation to the word sovereignty, and we've covered the first part. We'll do the remainder in the first half tomorrow in 1 hour, and then we will move to territory, finish territory by the second half tomorrow. It's a small topic, and then we will move to citizenship, and then everybody will be together. Okay? All right. Thank you. Have a good day, and I believe you have a class in the evening also with some other teacher. So that is it. These are the notions of sovereignty as you would know them, and thank you. Bye bye.